Hello, Pod A students. Today we are going to talk about Chapter 2, Section 2, Forms of Government. We're going to compare and contrast those forms of government, looking at what are some of the advantages and disadvantages. So, throughout the world, we have several different nation states. Although some of those countries have existed for hundreds of years, some are somewhat new, but all of them have some form of functioning government. So all of the governments fall into three broad categories. Rule by one, like monarchies and dictatorships, rule by the few, a theocracy and single-party states, or rule by the many, parliamentary and presidential democracies. So we're going to talk about those today. We're going to start with monarchies. So a monarchy is ruled by one hereditary ruler. They are one of the oldest forms of government, still found in the world today. Advantages and disadvantages include, we'll start with pros or advantages. It can be very efficient. Monarchies, one of the main attractions is efficiency. The ruling monarch has been able to make decisions and have them carried out on their word alone. They don't have to get the approval of political parties per se. Another pro would be that there's not a lot of confusion in terms of the line of succession. If it's a family of rulers, there's a clear line. The nation state knows who's going to be the ruler from one generation to the other. However, there's disadvantages that come with that as well, which we'll talk about in a second. The third advantage is the unifying power of a monarchy. So typically within that nation state, there's a lot of loyalty to that ruling family, and that could lead to a stronger bond holding that nation together. Disadvantages, on the other hand, or drawbacks, is that the quality of leaders can really vary from one generation to the next. So one monarch in one generation might be excellent, exemplary, great ruler, loved by their people. It could be followed by an incompetent one, and we've seen that throughout history. Kind of think back to ninth grade world history, and you should be able to think of a couple of examples. Another disadvantage or drawback is that running a modern nation state, so in today's society, is really difficult for one ruler. You would have to be a very exceptional monarch with a lot of approval from the people to be able to carry out that rule on your own. So two big examples of modern monarchies is Great Britain. It's probably the one that you're most familiar with. The Queen of England still sits as a form of power, but today her actual power or authority is really in the hands of the Prime Minister. In Great Britain today, the monarchy's functions are really strictly ceremonial. The real power rests with Great Britain's democratically elected leaders and parliament, which we'll talk about a little bit later. In contrast to that, Saudi Arabia's king has very broad powers. It's an inherited position. They have legislative, executive, and judicial powers. There's no parliament in place. There's no recognized political parties or national elections in Saudi Arabia. So in theory, that leader exercises a lot of power over its people, which has led to political unrest and conflict at various times. The second form of government that we're going to talk about is a theocracy. Again, probably familiar with theocracies based on some of the things that you studied in ninth grade world history. A theocracy is government ruled by religious leaders. So there's a big emphasis on religion. Historically, ancient city-states, theocracies were very common. Government officials were also religious leaders. There were clear benefits to this by having a single state-supported religion. It encourages political and social unity, so that was seen as an advantage. It also typically ensured that political decisions were in line with what people's moral values or beliefs were, if that was the belief system of that nation state. As time has progressed and people have evolved, morals and values have evolved, different religious groups and sects have formed, this often leads to more of a disadvantage. So it can be very difficult to enforce religious unity as we have differing opinions. Oftentimes we see in theocracies religious minorities are marginalized or maybe even persecuted. It results in warfare, revolution, really just political and social instability and unrest, which can be really difficult on the people of that area. As of right now, there are two theocracies that still exist, the Vatican City and Iran. The Vatican is the center of the Catholic Church. Even though it's in Rome, Italy, it is an independent state that's headed by the Catholic Pope. Iran, you are probably also familiar with as being a modern theocracy. We talked about it in 9th grade world history. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 is when Iran changed from a monarchy to a theocracy. And really focusing on that Islamic law and making that the enforceable policy in that nation. Dictatorships would be, again, going back to that concept of rule by one, like a monarchy, it's only one ruler. The difference with the dictatorship is that typically where monarchs inherit their power, dictators typically take and hold their power by force. The example, the picture that we have here of Gaddafi, he took control of Libya in a military coup in 1969. Eventually, he was overthrown, but if you can see the timeline, he was in power for a long time before he was overthrown in 2011. So it is not uncommon that that's how dictators gain power during a time of political unrest or a national emergency, that one person would come in and seize power. Dictatorships do share some characteristics of absolute monarchies. Power is centralized in the hand of one leader or a military or political leader. There is efficiency because it's just one person getting that thing done. But again, it's rule by force. They might use the military or police to maintain that order. That can be difficult on the people of that nation state, and dictatorships typically face serious legitimacy problems. Pressure builds up over time. People want a voice, people want to be heard, they want elections, and that might lead to unrest like it did in Libya. Single-party states. Single-party state is going to be ruled by the political elite. In a single-party state, the Constitution only allows one political party to govern. Power is then exercised by leading members of that power who really form the nation's political elite. So a small group of people within a bigger group who have more power, typically more wealth, more education than others. And then they typically nominate candidates for public office who make most of the policy decisions. So in terms of pros, a single party system is going to avoid maybe some of the disagreement that happens or the partisanship that happens in multi-party states. So if there's a single party state, it might be easier to pass laws or to implement policy. However, the views of the political elite or that party elite might be really different than what the actual people of that nation state want, which could lead to, again, social and political unrest. Oftentimes people with different political views are shut out of the process completely. And China would be a modern day example of that. Your book talks a little bit more about China. The Communist Party is the only legal political party and has controlled the government there since 1949. Direct democracies, again, throwback to 9th grade world history. All those things are coming back to you. See, direct democracy, we first saw it in Athens, ancient Greece. Several thousand citizens would meet together to vote on laws. Every citizen had an equal voice in public affairs and decisions. In the modern world, that really doesn't exist. No country is really ruled as a pure direct democracy anymore. It would mean every single one of the people of that country participates in government decision making. It's really unrealistic with large populations. Switzerland probably comes close. Your book talks a little bit more about the referendum and initiative process where citizens can propose laws and submit them to voters. You can read about that in a little bit more detail in your book. How we typically see direct democracy in our own country is on a really small scale, like a small town, New England town meeting where people meet together, they discuss and solve local problems. Again, really small scale. Can't be done with large populations. Parliamentary versus presidential democracy. So, parliamentary democracy. Ruled by the many, the differences, but there's differences between these two groups. So in a parliamentary democracy, we typically see rule by a legislative majority. So modern examples, the UK, India, Australia. In this system, voters, people of that nation state are going to vote for members of parliament. So they elect lawmakers to represent them in this legislative body. The political party that wins the legislative majority then forms a new administration. The legislative majority then selects a member, so one of these voted for members of parliament, to be the leader or the prime minister, which has chief executive functions in that system. Typically, the person chosen is the leader of the party that has the most seats. They then choose other members to help them lead their executive branch. There's no real clear-cut separation between the executive and legislative branches in this type of system. Members of the majority usually vote with the prime minister, so it's typically easier to get legislation passed. That's a pro. There's less friction between the executive and legislative branches since they typically support one another. However, that lack of separation means there's no real check on the prime minister's power, and so sometimes the prime minister may lack the legitimacy and public support of a president. In that presidential democracy, then, this would be, again, ruled by the many, representatives of the people. So in the US, France, Russia, other Latin American countries, they are considered presidential democracies. Voters in these countries choose a president. So here we go again with our diagram, voters. But in this system, voters pick the president. Voters pick legislature, those lawmakers. They are choosing both of those people. And then there are checks and balances. There are different powers, executive powers and legislative powers in separate branches that allow those lawmakers to kind of represent the laws. President has checks and balances. President has to approve the laws, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But there is definitely more of a hands-on approach or an involvement from the people. So some advantages are that presidents are directly elected by the people, so they might be more responsive to the public than to their party. Sometimes they typically enjoy more legitimacy and public support than a prime minister does. The presidential system separates executive and legislative powers, like I said a minute ago. This allows the branches to watch over and check to try to prevent or abuses of power. And there's also fixed terms in a presidential system, which don't exist in parliament, that might allow it to become more stable because the prime minister in that parliamentary system can be dismissed at any time. But there's disadvantages too. It's almost impossible to remove presidents from power. We'll talk about that later on. Even if they're really unpopular or maybe they abuse their power in some way, we have a system, but it's difficult. And then presidents that are not from the political party that controls the legislature, there can be some gridlock there. So it slows down the process of passing laws. And we'll talk about all of these things further as we go on in this course. The last thing would be transitional or unstable governments. These are ones that are in transition. So we're moving from one form of government to the other. They're a dictatorship that's trying to become more democratic. They are a monarchy that's trying to implement more democracy. So oftentimes there can be countries and governments that are in transition. This might make them unstable because they're not able to function properly or effectively during that time. And your book talks about that a little bit. We have some historical examples. If we look at Somalia, we look at Libya. When we talked about like 2011, the political overthrow of Gaddafi, Arab Spring, that kind of political social uprising can leave certain governments unstable during that time. And that's not necessarily effective or as productive as some of the other forms of government that we talked about. So hopefully you've got a better idea of forms of government. Remember, you can always refer to Chapter 2, Section 2 of your textbook if you need a little bit more information. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.